If I was going to run a podcast course, first thing I would do is I would take people into a dark room where they couldn't see anything, and I would ask them to use their voice alone to persuade, entice, seduce, to make their voice the instrument that would pull us in this dark space. Because in essence, really, that's what radio is, really. There are no pictures, and you're purely using the power of the imagination. It is cinema par excellence. I had the opportunity to dabble in some of that today when I was speaking to David Gartner's group on the First Nations and Indigenous reporting, or something to that effect. About 30 people in the class, and really enjoyable opportunity to really speak about the craft of radio as an intimate piece of media from when it was first set up around the sort of 1920s, when it became mass almost. It was beginning to become mass, and then people sat next to a radio and they listened to it. It was the first social media, if not one of the first in modern mass communication. And a lot of what we know from radio actually translates very well into podcast. I mean, podcast and its intimacy derives from the very idea that radio is an intimate medium, that you can almost imagine speaking to your mum about the story you're telling. So we really shouldn't lose sight of that. You can't throw the baby and the bathwater away. Either can you throw the baby out of the bathwater. These elements of what you can learn in some of the traditional media still have very strong currencies in the new ones. But in essence, really, what podcast does or did, particularly for me, is from not working at a radio station anymore and having all that media and understanding how you could make very strong stories, I could now tell them myself. I could now put them online, and I could let everyone else or anyone else really enjoy in this art of storytelling that it just gives me tingles just thinking about some of the stories I've done. And I showed some of that to the group going to Gallipoli, the Dardanelles. A bunch of divers had been granted access to an area that was in a military zone. They demilitarized it, and they were allowing divers to come back to essentially look at some of the wrecks there were ships at the time that had been downed in the First World War. That campaign was led by Sir Ian Hamilton, and his great grandnephew was part of the team that came with us onto this diving expedition. I explained how before I set off, I had with me some condoms. And I used those condoms to wrap around the microphone and lower on a very extended cable, lower them about 30 meters down, so that some of the divers coming up on the ropes, when they breathed, you could actually hear them. And that comes across in the piece. It was an extraordinary story, which I did both in radio and TV. And there was a backstory as well, because I ran out of air. I got hit by a ribbon current way down, and that's one of those stories that stays with me. I also spoke about how when I couldn't find work in the UK, I then emigrated more or less to South Africa. I was there for about 18 months. And one of my proudest moments, first indeed meeting Mandela, shaking his hand, trying to ring my mum to say I'd shake Mandela's hand, being at a press conference where I could ask him a question. But actually the thing I was really equally proud about was a story that we made back then called First Time Voters, which was following 4 young people as they voted for the first time. And that story played on BBC Radio 4, the World Service, and on the eve of South Africa's election. And I will post a link to where you can find that story as well. We went through some tips, and I went through the idea that really it's about people's space and how we should be empathetic to that, and how we should grant people, it's a listening, this is about listening. It's not about telling, but having said that, there are many different styles of podcasts, from the very well-made package, as they call them in radio, where you're mixing together your voice and the voice of others, and sometimes there's some music, to the interview, the one-on-one, to sometimes the kind of monologue, which is employed somewhat in Serial, the well-known film by, it's a well-known podcast, but they also have interviews in there as well. And so the tips that I gave them at the end really were a couple of fold. I'll just sit down. I had them down here a minute ago. Ooh, has it gone off? Here it goes. So some of those tips are as follows. Tips for starting a good podcast. Have a good listening ear. Listen well. Search for character voices in the same way that you look for character faces when you're taking photographs. People, when you search out the person you're going to interview, sometimes it can't be helped. That's the person you're going to interview. But where you can, and it's a colour piece, the voice matters. The groaniness, the croaking, the elliptical nature of the way they might speak. That really matters. That's theatre. So search that out. Strong writing activates different parts of the brain. By saying it smells like vinegar activates a part of your sensory cortex that actually would activate if you were tasting vinegar. So saying things, using metaphor, is a great way of actually getting people immersed in your writing, very strong writing. Experiment beyond journalism. I mean, sometimes we tend to think that podcast belongs to a field of storytelling called journalism. It doesn't. It belongs to storytelling, period. But if you want to experiment with podcasts, don't just look within great journalism pieces, as great as they might be, but look for other things. Look for the way theatre works. Look for the way that great folklore storytelling works. Look for the way musicians may craft their own lyrics and so on and so forth, because that will give you other ideas that you can bring back into this fold. Foley, sound effects for the ears. Craft those sound effects that will pull people in. When I lived and worked, essentially was a postgraduate in Falmouth, Cornwall was a great place. The beach was a great place to go, which I did very often, and I would often record pieces there because of the sense of place of where you were, the pebbles, the seashore, the seagulls, all of that good theatre that would bring in the audience, make them feel that they were there. Be passionate really about your subject. There's no other way of saying this. If you can't feel it, I suspect the audience won't either. So really be involved in what you're doing. Articulate that, show that you really care. Be them, your favourite podcaster, and then be you. And by that, what I mean is follow exemplars and people who do great podcasts as a way of learning the craft. And as you begin to learn, you become more confident. At some point, you will find your own voice. You will do things differently. But, this idea of stealing like an artist, which is a book in itself, it is there to help. Take ideas, rework them, and then run with them. And then really respect the space and the place that you're entering. This is a vast field, but each person's story matters. And it's really up to you to ensure that you get those stories. Have a good listening here. Respect the places you're going in. Let people tell their stories. And then ask your what, or your how, or your why. But in essence, whilst we could listen to you, we'd also like to listen to others. Happy podcasting.